initially in Czech during the Civil War. Lots of people.
You're covering multi-countries now.
Yeah, well, Chris's old one is jam-packed full of junk. Well, yeah. It's my junk. I've cleared out his old junk, and there's bits of my computer.
You happen to know what the Wi-Fi password is for it now? The dungeon.
Yes. Which one are you seeing?
The dungeon.
Oh,
That's all you can see. Is there a password?
I don't know what it is, but it's one that you shouldn't use.
Oh, right, okay.
Picture right there, no?
Oh, yeah.
There's in the second floor.
Alright.
Do you need me to look?
Yeah, we're just trying to sort out the feed. So I'll take this off anyway. It's on that one, isn't it?
The page on there, but I'm playing it on the screen just to make sure that it's working.
I think that should be right. So it's opened up. So I'm just going to quickly ring the thing.
Okay. It's got on there. This one.
Yeah. I'm just ringing the thing because the stream's now fine. Yeah, so you just created a new one and it now says it's you look online. Oh yeah. We've just started the broadcast. If you go to the website, it says that the stream is private. Do we have to change that? Yeah. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So it's broadcasting. So okay. Yeah, it's not good. If you have to stop the stream, the address is changed. So it should be broadcasting what's on there.
Okay.
Okay, settle down, guys, settle down. The timer destiny is now Carmen's. Okay? Or nearly is, anyway.
There we go. I've got to open it PowerPoint in here. Where's the cursor going? Yeah, but I've lost the cursor.
If you get it on, yeah, it's in F5. Yeah, there you go.
Right, okay, straight into almonds. So we've got to be very strict with time. Yep.
Okay, so the presentation is entitled Archiving 2014. Now, you may read all sorts of things into 2014. The main reason is what can we do today in terms of doing archiving. But when I thought about it, I also thought about everyone is talking about 1914 and the Germans. So I thought this time we'll do it differently. So it's Archiving 2014, and it's not the Germans, but it's somebody else. So the question is, how do we get from our field data into data storage that is an archived data storage and not just a backup? And obviously, once it's in any sort of archived storage, it will go to the third party as well. Overview of this presentation, I will give a few definitions of what I mean when I talk about archiving, and then talk a few minutes about the rationale, why we should be archiving. And if you have read the abstract, I say there, most people will agree that archiving is a good thing, but actually that may not be the case. I may just be thinking that is the case. And then costs, obstacles of doing it, and then finally, what can we do today in order to get our data archived? So a few definitions. What do I mean when I say archiving? I talk here about the data, the digital data that are to be archived. So I'm not talking about grey literature which goes into some repository. I'm talking not about artifacts which will be archived in, for example, a museum, but I'm really talking about the geophysical data that we collect and what is going to happen to them. In addition, for example, if I look at my own field practice, I do take notes in the field in a notebook. I don't use a handheld device for this. Some people do. And therefore, I do scan my field notes and put them in with the archive. So maybe somebody is doing this as well. And then some metadata. I'm not going to talk in great length about metadata. I will just say that metadata describe what we do, and they are a kind of associate information that is important in order to understand the data that we have collected. But then, when I talk about archiving and what is an archive, it's important to make a few definitions, because when I say an archive, you may just think of a library as the archive. What I mean when I say archive is a collection of all the electronic files and folders, or objects if you want, that go together to make one project. That is for me the archive, and that's why I spell it with a capital A, the archive. And then this archive will be deposited to an archiving body. So somebody is keeping track of the archive and make sure that this archive is maintained for a particular length of time, preferably for in perpetuity, but that's not really realistic. And then we also have to talk about indexing and migration. And with migration, I mean we have to make sure that what is in the archive can be used again in future. If you are old enough, probably most of you aren't, you will have heard of WordPerfect being a word processing package many, many years ago, and hardly anyone can read these files anymore. And I have some other documents which I recently found in my own archive, and I can't read them anymore because the software isn't there. So there is a case for making sure that we update the data to the latest version of software that can read it. It may sound trivial. You may also say, okay, we have XML data and text files, and that's easy to read. But still, it may well be that in 20 years' time, nobody knows what an XML file is. That's quite possible. That's what is called migration, and indexing is simply making the data available and making them findable. That's a really bad word. Backup of working data is not archiving, and that's an important point. So I'm assuming that all of you will be backing up your data, your working data, but that in itself is not archiving. Archiving, it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing, and often it's such that the geophysical data can be the only remaining record of archaeological features in the ground. It's not always such that everything is being excavated, but there are sometimes features which are still important to analyze later on when everything else has been extracted. So they may be the only archaeological archive. It's often important to reinterpret data. There is an old adage by one of the senior German geophysicists who said, the geophysical data are always and forever right. And it's only the archaeological interpretation that may change. And clearly we all know an archaeological interpretation is a subjective thing that will depend on your own knowledge. I'm becoming a post-processualist. It will depend on everything else you know about the landscape. And therefore, if your archaeological understanding and knowledge changes, you may end up with a different interpretation of exactly the same data. So the data will always be right. It's our archaeological interpretation which may change in 20 years' time, for example, and hence it's important to have still the data. We may be able to do research for whole regions and landscapes, and it's important to get a corpus of information such that we can derive statements about which archaeological expressions we can form based on geophysical surveys in what areas. And that's actually quite important to have the data and not just a report in order to do this. New methods of data processing, and obviously also for training, and that has been touched upon before, and I think Peter's going to talk about some of this as well. And we have to, and I just show you here some highlighted aspects of the paragraph 141 of the NPPF. It starts with the local planning authority having the obligation to make the information publicly accessible. Now there can be different ways of doing this, but it carries on saying it requires the developers to record and advance the understanding in a manner proportionate and put the evidence in archives for the public to access. So basically, we have to do the archiving because it is requested and demanded. I'm not quite sure how thoroughly this is enforced, probably not very much, but it's basically there. What are the steps? And I will come back to this later when I say what are the tools we may have. Creating an archive. Sorting files into a logical folder structure is something which is the first step. And most of us will do this in any case, because we will set up for a project a folder structure on our IT systems, and then we just place everything into the right place. Then we need to export raw and processed data into a format which we can preserve. That goes back to my statement about migration of data. We need to create a brief description of all these files and all these folders, because it's all very well having a logical folder structure, but if you don't describe it at all, it still is difficult to make sense of. And we have to create a record of metadata which describe the geophysical survey. For example, what is the line spacing that we have used, and so on. Some of this information may be recorded with your data, but it's not always easy to access. So for example, if you use geoplot, it's all in the geoplot files, but you would need to know exactly where to search in order to find this. Then, if we have the archive, we put it into the archiving body. What options do we have there? The simplest option is, and I would still call this archiving, an in-house solution. whereby the archived files are kept, for example, by the contractor and maintained for a certain length of time. Whether that's desirable or not, it's then a different discussion. The second possibility is to go for a file repository. These days you would talk about cloud storage, and you can take all of your compiled data and put them into a storage place. And if the service level agreement is such that they say they will guarantee that the data are stored in triplicate and available in perpetuity, then you have certainly a storage possibility. But it's still a storage and not necessarily easy to retrieve. The third level is sort of building on the second one. It's a managed archive where, in addition, you provide what I talked about before, migration and indexing. And then the last one is when you use the migration and indexing and then make all the data available, let's say, to the public or to somebody who has access rights to this data. So that will be then the fourth level, accessible archiving. We need to talk about costs, because clearly archiving does come with costs. You can't just say we need to archive the data and it's not going to cost anyone anything. That's not the case. You have to be quite clear about this. And if we factor this in our survey, we have to say, okay, we provide a service which is geophysical survey, reporting, and archiving, and it costs so much money. Now, clearly, there is a question in terms of the overall cost, who wins a tender. And obviously, there is an expectation that one should put in as little for the cost as possible in order to win the tender. So what do we do in terms of the archiving? The archive itself, creating the archive, more or less can be estimated by hectare and technique. So if you say, I have a GPR survey of 20 hectares, you know more or less how much data this is, and you can give a cost of archiving production. But then the difficult question is, what is the cost of the archiving body once you deposit this archive to an archiving body? And that, I think, at the moment is one of the major stumbling blocks, that we can't easily say we provide a costing for this because we don't know entirely what the archiving body will charge. But what is important, therefore, is that we need a very clear upfront statement saying this is what is required for the archiving, because otherwise you can't just have different people giving very different quotes in terms of the cost in respect of what the archiving they provide will do. For example, if somebody says, okay, nobody has specified what archiving body I should choose, so I just go for in-house archiving and I have my server and that's archiving. Fine, doesn't cost anything basically. Somebody else says, actually I want to do it such that it is fully accessible and indexed and everything's on the ADS website, for example, quite expensive, hence it would be a very different thing. So unless we specify, or let's say the curators specify what archiving is required, then it's not an even playing field. So we had some anecdotal evidence that some archaeological curators said archiving with a registered archive. I don't know what a registered archive might be, but saying that ADS is the most appropriate option. Partly because that's the most widely known archive which is available in the UK. I think I have to speed up. Who pays for the costs? The NPPF actually is quite clear about this. The payment comes through the developer. But the bottom line is that it's the planning authority which is required to make the information publicly available. So the bottom line is it's the planning authority, but the planning authority will always push it towards the developer, because that's how it is all phrased. So the question is, if that's all we need to do, why don't we do it? Why don't we create these tins of preservation? There may be problems with imprecise requirements. it's still a bit unclear what is involved, and there is the perception that it's actually very difficult. And hence, some ideas, what can we do these days, today? What have I done yesterday with my geophysical data? Before you start a project, you decide about a folder structure. Or your company has a policy on doing this. It may be very straightforward, like something like this: project site, survey block, technique, format. Very easy. Doesn't have to be overly fancy. And then as you go along and do your survey, you just sort all your data into this folder structure. So that actually, once it's finished the project, it doesn't really involve much more. You need to decide, however, what to do with proprietary data. Let's say, just for the sake of Roger Walker sitting here, you use Geoplot, then you need to think of how do you get the data from Geoplot into your site repository. And for example, some people then just make copies and say composite and grid and mesh, but actually if you do it this way, it's difficult to put it back into the Geoplot folder structure. So this, for example, is a very small snippet of code you can use to copy it easily across and copy it back into the Geoplot structure. Nearly all proprietary software has export formats, and we can discuss which export formats are important. I specifically don't mention here Surfer format, although I have great sympathy for using Surfer. I can't full-heartedly support it because there are quite some quirks which aren't entirely in line with easy retrievable options. But there are other issues related to gridded data. Then once we have a folder structure, we need to think of ways of getting it into a documentation. The folder structure can easily be exported, again with some scripts. We need to think of metadata, and for this we can either use the template, we can try, and that's actually not a bad method, we can try to do it all via Oasis. You enter your data into Oasis, export it as an XML, and you have it all. Now, if we go for in-house archiving, this one is actually the City Archive of Cologne, or that's what was left of it. So in-house archiving isn't always a good idea. Okay. We can go for cloud storage, and this is something I've set up for a project where it's actually extremely cheap to buy storage space. It costs me 30 pence per gigabyte per year, but obviously the question is, how easy is it to access? I can provide an archiving solution to one of my clients where I say I put all the data onto the archive and it doesn't cost very much, actually hardly worth charging for this. But the question is, how easily can it be retrieved? Then there are official sites. This one is TIDA, the Digital Archaeological Record. That's the US equivalent, sort of the ADS. And they have a very clear charging policy, which actually is very useful because you can in advance say what it will cost. For example, 50 to 99 files cost about $30 per file. At least you know. ADS, the traditional ADS, is expensive because it's manual. You have to give them your files, they archive it for you, and it takes a lot of time and is therefore expensive. But ADS Easy is the new version they are currently developing, and it's a beta version and it's available on the ADS website, where you can upload yourself. And for example here, I've just pulled this one out. It's one image file and it costs just £1 plus 150 pounds for the overall project. But obviously if you have one project, 150, and then you have all your other files, it's not hugely expensive. And the good thing is it's linked to the OASIS record, so if your project is in OASIS, most of the metadata are there in any case. So, conclusion is, it's actually not that bad. All you need is the guide to good practice. And for 20 copies, please take one. It really needs to be read. And I'm not going to charge for it, and I'm not going to take them back home. If you want to make a donation, that's fine. Archiving doesn't have to be hard, but it very much requires clear specifications. So we can't just say data have to be archived, because that is similarly bad as saying we have to have a geophysical survey. That's as vague as it gets. And clearly there are costs, and we can't neglect these. Thank you.
You've been told.
No.
No, you haven't been told.
No, you haven't been told. That was just a presentation.
Ian Barnes, National Trust. Imagine an organisation like the National Trust whose strapline is forever for everyone. I'd say to Armin's talk a little further and say it's not a task archiving, it's a professional duty. And otherwise, how to do preservation by record?
Yes.
It's not. And I'd say sort of on a more philosophical point, and it's the one thing that would discriminate us, say, from the geotechnical industry. This is proper archaeological research. You wouldn't dig a trench without thinking. Now, the ultimate conclusion of any project is not finished till the archive is deposited, it's in the van, and it's gone to a registered museum. And it should be just the same with digital data.
So Armin didn't see it, but it do, but he insists. Very quick, one more question, otherwise we're already way behind schedule.
Of the geophysics data that is archived already,
yes.
Is there any record of retrieval of that? You know, how often are all these files?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think they will be retrieved very often. That's my guess.
There's a Society of Museum Archaeologists publication recently looking at the access of archaeological archives. I don't know if it covers geophysical data anymore. It's on the SMA website.
Very quickly.
Quick comment, Roger Walker, Geoscan Research. Just for information, I mean, it is possible to change the option structure so that the surveys are stored in a more of a project-based system rather than a strange way of it by standard.
Okay.
To elaborate on that.
Yes.
Okay, listen, thank you, Armin. That's I'm sure that there's plenty of.
Please don't take one. Really.
I mean, it's a good read. It's a good read. Okay, where are we? Next up is, let me see, is Peter Hearn. Peter, let me see. No. Don't know what have we done with the mouse? Does anybody see the mouse? Oh, there it is. I just see it there. Let's see. Let's see. Open. Is it on there? Tell me when we see yours. Keep going. He's doing it now. Let's see. Ooh, come on. Come on. Yes, thank you very much. Good. I hope that's going to go.
Yeah, it's there.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. That's a bit weird. Okay. Next up is Peter talking about the curse of the newbie.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Peter Ahern. The topic of my talk this morning, and we've already touched on it very slightly in Hannah's talk, is a plea on behalf of junior members of staff. I studied for my bachelor's degree at the University of Chester as a mature student, and then completed a master's degree at York in medieval archaeology between 2006 and 2011. During my studies, I became very interested with all aspects of surveying our archaeological heritage, and the manipulation of those collected data. For some reason the slides aren't changing, but never mind.
It's a bit old, but it's not. Yeah, resume. Just resume. Resume. Press the return.
Yes, the left and right arrows.
That's it. It needs to resume.
Well, we can leave it on that one anyway.
Yeah, yes, you use this.
Apologies. Still not, it's not coming up on the screen now for some reason. That's better. Okay, so I got as far as saying that I'd studied for my Masters in Medieval Archaeology at the University of York. And as I said, I became very interested in studying all aspects of surveying of our archaeological heritage and the manipulation of those collected data by computers, for example in a GIS. This has led to a further spell of university education, this time at Birmingham University, where I have just completed 6 modules of their landscape archaeology with GIS and virtual worlds masters. Try saying that when you've had a few pints. And I'm hoping to be awarded a postgrad diploma. This brief resume of my academic career will give you an indication that I am a very junior member of this industry. As a junior member of this industry, I have some grave fears for our industry, which I'd like to share with you today. And I think I need to make 3 key points. Firstly, junior staff are as important to an organization as senior members of staff, because they are the people who will hopefully take over from the senior staff when they leave the organization. Training for all members of staff is a key to the development of the organization. And I also feel that the ability to provide highly trained members of staff at all levels of the organization provides considerable cost benefits throughout the organization and makes our organizations highly sought after by our clients. This conference has been designed to look at all aspects of commercial archaeological geophysics, but I would like to suggest that there has to be a radical change within commercial archaeology in general for it to survive. We as juniors have to make sure that we are competent enough to become seniors in the industry and to replace those there now. However, many junior staff in archaeology are not employed on long enough contracts to be able to put in place training schemes that will help them advance their careers. We cannot do that when we have little chance of getting any experience or training. This, I feel, is having a detrimental effect on our industry. Senior managers, I would argue, have a responsibility to maintain the level of expertise within their organizations. Therefore, I would like to suggest that they should liaise with their junior members of staff to ensure that expertise is being maintained. This industry has suffered perhaps its most daunting recession over the last 5 or 6 years. At the beginning of the recent recession, I voiced the opinion that this was now an ideal opportunity to instigate training schemes while staff had time to attend them. Instead, we have lost many of our most eminent members due to redundancy, retirement, and most sadly, death. One thinks of such great people as Professors Mick Aston and Arnold Aspinall, to name but 2. I and my junior colleagues have to try and fill their shoes, an extremely difficult task, but one I am prepared to attempt. I need help to do that. I need the encouragement of senior staff still left in the industry. It is therefore more important than ever for an organization to show that they have the future of the industry at heart. It seems now that we're coming to the end of a recession as work appears to be increasing. I have tried on numerous occasions to gain employment in this industry, and whilst I have achieved that, working for the likes of Oxford Archaeology, Cambrian Archaeological Projects, Stratascan and Wardell Armstrong Archaeology, all these periods of employment have been on very short-term contracts with little prospect of long-term development. I have on each occasion attempted to demonstrate my enthusiasm for the industry by asking local supervisors and/or project officers for experience in other aspects of the process before and after the main project has happened. Sadly, this has not materialized. I feel that I am therefore being hindered from advancing the development of my career because I cannot get a long-term contract with an organisation where I can help put a structured development programme in place. As a member of the IFA, at the moment at affiliate level, I am keen to upgrade that membership to practitioner. One of the key aspects of our membership of the IFA is a programme of continued professional development. The crucial word of that last phrase is development. We have to show that we are attending courses, conferences, and other forms of developmental studies in order to increase our knowledge of the area of our industry that we may particularly specialise in. How can I do that if I'm not in a regular contract with an organisation? If I choose to attend a conference such as this, or a day school at the Oxford University Department of Continuing Education, and I then get an offer of employment that clashes with my already paid for registration for the likes of the above, I may well lose that opportunity of work and have to return to the pages of Badger and the IFA Jobs Information Service to find a suitable alternative. I'm therefore spending an absolute fortune on expanding my knowledge, something I am more than willing to do, with little prospect of putting that knowledge into practice. The best way to learn is not to sit in classrooms learning the theory of various applications. Clearly that's very important. But to actually get out there and get our boots muddy, as W.G. Hoskins put it. I would like to appeal therefore to companies to have a structured development programme in place for all their employees, and especially their most junior members. We are the people who will have to take over from you when you retire or decide, God forbid, to leave our industry. You can pass on your considerable knowledge and, more importantly perhaps, learn from us, and together we can expand the knowledge base within that organisation. If an organisation is well known for its rigorous training programme for its staff, it demonstrates to the rest of the industry what a first-class organisation that is. This will also help our clients decide to come to that particular organisation first, because they know straight away that they are going to get exactly what we outline in the written scheme of investigation, the environmental impact assessment or the desk-based assessment, that we present at the beginning of a process. I am sure that a slight increase in the costing of a project to include training of members of staff on that project will bring compensations within that contract. Perhaps an earlier than expected completion date, because jobs have been done correctly and completed well within the timescale. But more importantly, that this particular project has helped to train future members of staff. Hopefully the developer will be keen to employ our services again because of the standards we have set. There are a number of methods that companies can use to fund projects of training, such as I am suggesting. Some of these are virtually cost-free. Why can't senior site managers set aside, say, an hour of a day to take half a dozen junior members of staff and show them a particular aspect of the excavation project? For example, how to use a total station to record coordinates within the project, or how to manipulate data gathered from a magnetometry or resistivity survey. Heritage lottery funding has been used very effectively to provide workplace learning schemes for all levels of staff through collaboration with the IFA. The CBA and other major national archaeological societies offer grants for research. Perhaps if these funds were used more freely, then training places can be provided for staff. Crucially, however, we should not let enthusiastic members of staff slip through our hands and be lost because they cannot get what they are after. You may have thought that this talk has been a plea on my behalf. This, to a certain extent, is true. But I'm sorry, the slides aren't progressing. This, to a certain extent, is true, but it is also a passionate plea to all of you to either put in place training within your own organisations, or to badger your line manager or other senior colleagues to provide some sort of training in an aspect you want to study. For those of you who are members of the IFA, this also forms a key element of your demonstration to the IFA that you are on a continuing professional development curve. If you are continually rejected, then I would ask you to report this to the IFA if your organisation is a member, because that is, or argue it should be, one of the criteria that the organisation has to match to achieve registered organisation status. I've looked at 3 key issues in this talk. That's not me, sorry. I've looked at 3 key issues in this talk, which are, firstly, that junior members of staff are as important to an organisation as senior members of staff. Secondly, that training is an important issue in our future development within an organisation, if our future development within an organisation is to be realised. And lastly, that the ability to provide highly trained members of staff at all levels of the organisation will provide considerable cost benefits throughout the organisation and make our organisations highly sought after by our clients. If any of you would like to discuss this with me afterwards, I'd be only too happy to do so. And I've beaten the clock.
No prizes for beating the clock. I mean, obviously there's some very that came from the heart. That came from the heart, definitely. And there's obviously some more general points I think that came out there, especially with things like CPD just as a concept.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, how do we do this? How do we promote CPD? You know, I remember when about 5 years ago when I made a very big proclamation about CPD, and I talked to them about whether we could be of help. You know? And I found out that basically the ideas of CPD didn't actually relate to what I believed CPD would be. And so I think there's this low level, there's upskilling, and I just wonder where we feel we are as a profession. And we would like to have perhaps clarifying points, please, Martin.
I mean, CPD is obviously essential, and most professional organisations actually demand this. So it's the same issue for every individual as well as every organisation. The problem we have is there are very few opportunities. Events like this are accountable at CPD. It's meet, it's networking there. That's good.
Mm-hmm.
But outside the umbrella, there's hardly anything available. We can go and do courses, repeating work we've done, things we taught at university many years ago, but there's not much to bring sustained knowledge on. Now, I haven't got an answer to that.
No.
So that has been the status quo for many, many years in this industry. So sometimes we need to start getting interested in how the industry wants CPD, and what initiatives can we put in place, and more importantly, how can we be funded?
Well, if I remember correctly, a lot of the IFA sort of ideas, it's very much a personal thing, you know. That's,
Yeah.
That's it's the individual's right and responsibility, and I think that therein lies, some of the key issues. Said you pay as an individual.
Yeah. I think one of the points I'm trying to get across is that you have to expand the word training. So take it out of the classroom. It can be anything. It can be something that you've spotted while you've been on a project, and you say, "Oh, I'd like to learn a little bit more about that," and go and see a senior member of staff who knows something about that. So, like I said, if I'm talking about using a total station, I'd like to find somebody who knows about that and who can actually teach me that.
Yeah, James, can I be controversial here?
Please do.
Can I put the blame firmly at the university's feet with this? Because archaeology should be a vocational degree, surely to God. You should be learning all this stuff as an undergraduate. You shouldn't expect to then go out into a commercial atmosphere and expect them to have to train you to do the things that you should learn.
I actually do agree with you. I do agree with you.
Back in the day, I remember the first commercial unit saying that the problem with the university is that university students come out and have to train them to do everything. Okay? And there's an expectation. There's you know, frankly, if we could teach everybody everything in a single course, you know, that universities would be in a great state.
How can you even potentially more controversial, throw it back to the commercial companies? Should it not be for us to go to universities and offer our services? I mean, can we not go to universities and say, you have students, we have sites, let's work together, and then we can provide the students with the training and some expertise, and that will find them ready to go and then work commercially.
It's an interesting concept.
I think we need to sort of go back to the original scenario of commercial archaeology when in the early 1990s, as a result of PPG 16, a lot of the commercial archaeology companies were the university archaeology departments, and since that time, more non-university department archaeological companies have started up as commercial archaeology, and they've drifted away from the university aspect. University archaeology departments were able to give their students opportunities to work on a commercial project as a result of.
Okay. Can we keep the points short? Okay.
Okay. There is a reason that there's hardly any of those left now, because they couldn't survive in the commercial world. I think Duncan's is one of the few that's still associated with the university. Nearly all the others have had to either go on their own or just fail.
Yeah.
I think there are 4 left. I think.
Quick one.
Alex Corcoran, Masters. Is there not a concern that a commercial investment in the more ephemeral junior staff members will only benefit other companies?
It's an interesting point, because when you say that you know you only stay for a short time. Why the hell should somebody pay for you to upgrade your skill set if you're going somewhere else? I think that's a valid point, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I've come from the transport industry. I've worked as a lorry driver for 30 years. Now, if a haulage company is prepared to put me through an HGV driving training course, then I have to a certain extent commit to them for, say, 5 years or something like that. In my own case, I am prepared to commit to any company who is willing to guide me and nurse me and nurture me through the process.
Okay, that's good. It's good for the start. No, let's finish there. We can take this one on later. We have another talk. Thanks, Peter. Just like to say, just having a little look on Twitter. Andreas Weiberg has just said online participation in CAGS 2014. Sweet. Thanks, guys, for the interesting talks. Hello, Andreas. Hope you're well. But also, there's points coming out about vocational degrees. Whether we're doing enough on archiving data. Perhaps you want to contribute to that. You know, I mean, the answer to some of the questions may not be in this room. Okay, so perhaps if you can widen that out a bit, that would help us. Thank you. Okay, we'll go on to the next talk, and let me see. Where are we? Oh, yeah. So it's going to be Ken Hamilton. This can't possibly be controversial.
I don't know. Well, the universities are completely wrong. I've got a fallback at the moment, Ken. Let me see, which one's yours there then?
That's some of Tom so
yeah, put it on.
I have put it on.
Yeah, let's see if I can find.
See when you click the
yeah, see if you can find it.
Please.
Yeah.
By the way.
Get rid of that one for the moment.
Top one.
Oh yeah. And then I think just press F5. And as long as you keep your mouse in there when you click, or just use left and right arrow. Okay.
Right, last one before lunch then.
Oh yeah. Just right to give people indigestion. Right, good afternoon. My name's Ken Hamilton, and I used to be a geophysicist. I now know that I've been in archaeology too long, so I've got a Latin title for my slide. There's a prize for anyone who guesses what that means and where it comes from. In actual fact, the talk itself comes from a conversation I was having with a commercial geophysicist someone else listened in and they said, well, it's easy to know what your view of commercial magnetometry is. You think we're all rubbish. And and that's not true. And what I want is for us to be better. And that's the kind of aim behind this. We've had this talk will bring in elements of every talk we've had this morning. One of the things that hasn't been discussed, though, is the variability in surveys due entirely to the surveyors. And that's basically what I'm going to talk about. Just now, geophysics should be in a better position than it's ever been in terms of British archaeology. We've had the quotes from the MPPF. Hannah read it out earlier. I'm not going to read that one out again. What I will read out is the bit about the level of detail being proportionate to the asset's importance, because that's absolutely key, and that's where geophysics really comes in. If this work's going to be done pre-application, this is where a geophysical survey really, really helps. So why are we having a seminar that is described on its own publicity material as looking at the issues, concerns, and points of disagreement? And another of the conference flyers talked about a disenfranchised archaeological geophysical sector. That's not, to my mind, that isn't reflected in what's meant in the thrust of the NPPF. So I'm going to use a couple of case studies. They are hopefully anonymous. They're as anonymous as I can make them. If you recognize your own data, keep quiet, because hopefully no one else will know. I'm sorry if they are identifiable. My aim here is not to say that geophysics is rubbish. Clearly, I don't think that. My aim here is to show you, decent practitioners of archaeological geophysics, what I receive as a curator from other contractors mostly. Don't worry about the interpretations. In most cases, they're not relevant. Right. So, honestly, to this talk, and in some cases to the site. So we have some issues that are common to all geophysical projects. The first is method statements. If your project is being carried out as part of a planning condition, then your method statement forms part of a written scheme of investigation. It's a legal document. That is a legally binding document, which means a one-page sheet that you always produce for every single survey is not enough. It's not good enough for us. We have regional standards that say exactly what's required in the method statement. If your method statements don't contain what's in those regional standards, we have to send them back because they're a legal document. It's a slightly grayer area for a pre-application survey, which most geophysical surveys are, but I'd like to think that people would be keen to demonstrate their understanding of the site and how their methodology is going to answer the questions that site has to offer most effectively, and doing that in the method statement stage, because that makes it a lot more easy to argue from a planning point of view to contractors, to consultants, to planning officers, and to, if necessary, to the planning inspectorate. Anyway, enough about method statements. Site staff, qualifications and experience. I monitored a site not that long ago, fairly major, fairly important site. 2 people on site with magnetometers. One of them had graduated with a degree in biology a month beforehand. The other one had graduated with a degree in history 5 months beforehand. That's the entire site staff, and that's their experience. That, to my mind, for a geophysical site team is not good enough. I would like to see a decent quantity of archaeological geophysical experience. I'd like to see, hopefully, some geophysical theoretical knowledge and then the ability to be able to discuss what's coming out in the results in terms of the physics of it, rather than in terms of the shapes it makes when you do your filtering. Unimaginative methodologies is that's my problem. That's what I do. I keep putting out a generic brief for a magnetometer survey, and I ask for it, and every time I come back with a number of method statements for a magnetometer survey. Now, I'm not always right. I don't always have time to think it through, and I make mistakes, that kind of thing. Only once in 8 years has a geophysical contractor phoned me up and said, "No, you don't want to use that technique. Use a different technique that will be better." And I said, "Yeah, that's a great idea. On you go." And that I can't even remember if that project went ahead. But that's only once in 8 years. Why isn't that happening now? Why aren't you looking at briefs and saying, "Well, it would be far better if we did it another way," and coming back to the curators with that? There is poor data collection technique on site that ties into qualifications and experience of site staff, but it also ties into people not really caring. about what the end result of the data is. And this comes back to Hannah's point earlier about there not being feedback in the process from two geophysicists. You're not seeing the excavations of your surveys, so you have less at stake. So there's less of an incentive for you to take the time and the effort to collect the data so that it's not heavily striped or whatever. And then various gripes about reports. You will always hear about these from me. But one thing to bear in mind is that if I have a method statement from a geophysical contractor that is capable of doing the job, I can't turn it back and say, I won't accept this method statement. If that contractor has a track record of not producing reports, then I can say you have a track record of not producing reports. I will not approve your method statement. That is the only weapon I've got to stop poor quality contractors, and I do use it. So let's look onto some data. This survey, well, I hope you can see that the data change very clearly in nature just to the south of this orange line here. Now, that is a grid line. I phoned up the contractor and I said, what's going on here? And he said, oh, they were using a different top dressing. It's a soil surfacing thing. They're using slag, and that's affected the geophysical survey results. And I said, but it actually matches the grid edge right the way along. It turns the corner around like that. Oh, no. John, you were asking about contractors who had reports who got told that we refused to accept. This one, that went straight back, and that contractor has never worked in the county again, and will not work in the county again until he goes out and does that survey again, which will be a bit difficult because they've now quarried it. But the result of that, and anyone who's received a brief from me will know that I now ask for one grid every day to be repeated, just to make sure, so that if you get a situation like that, it should be obvious if you've got an issue with your instrument. This is something that happens that I used to do when I worked in engineering geophysics, so I don't see why archaeologists shouldn't do it, and it's not exactly that it takes a long time. But if you are looking at repeatability, there's absolutely no point in using two different dynamic ranges in that. So they're not comparable data. I have absolutely no idea what dynamic range those ones are put at. I don't know which direction's north. There's no north arrow on either of them. So we need to think about how we're producing images in these. I'm old-fashioned. I like to ask for properly actual raw data. It's the way I was trained, the way I worked myself. But if I get a standard, now this is on chalk. I'm from Norfolk. It's all chalk. Look at the dynamic range on that. 100 to minus 100 nanotesla. They might as well just have saved the ink. But you can see the striping of it, which is quite interesting. Data interpretation. I will talk very briefly about these two. Now, in actual fact, my beef with this particular interpretation involves the interpretation diagram itself, but I can't put that up because they tend to be very specific to individual contractors. What it is, it's quite clearly a ring ditch. You've got a ditch. You've got a bit of a dipolar signal going on with the ditch fill, and I don't quite know why. The interpretation came back with the ditch here and a bank on the inside, on the south half of the ring ditch, and on the outside, That was on the interpretation diagram. The archaeologist on site said, I haven't found any trace of this bank. Of course you haven't. But it should have been picked up at the QC stage. But this sort of thing is not uncommon. This is it's called a spectacle dispersal pen. It's a Second World War airfield method of dispersing aircraft. What you can see in the geophysical data is this long, thin feature here. The report made a great deal about the fact that this is a taxiway visible on the aerial photograph, the 1946 aerial photograph, which is running down there, which is actually running in that direction. So it's just completely in the wrong place. And so this feature was not in any way discussed. So I sent the report back and said, it's in a different place, it needs to be discussed. I've since heard nothing from this particular contraction. This survey is well over a year old. There's no attempt to reinterpret the data or go back to it. This is what you're up against from people who are producing reports at £180 a hectare or whatever it is they're charging. I will just point out how much care they took on collecting the data on the side of the stepping in that there. I questioned this, and they said, oh, well, the ground conditions on the site were very difficult. I was on site. I monitored them on site. They refused to show me the raw data on site, which I thought was very suspicious. And the ground conditions were not difficult. I've worked for more difficult sites than that. So anyway, that's so much for the data. So I've had some bad experiences. So what? I'm a curator. That's what I do. But every single time I get a difficult report, it creates a problem for me because I've then got to sort that out. Now, 3 years ago, we were subjected to a 38% funding cut. We're now going through an additional 12% funding cut and a one-off funding cut of £1 million. We may have to find an additional £26 million very, very shortly, depending on what Eric Pickles decides. That's neither here nor there. So my point there is, I've got bigger things concerning me than geophysical surveys. So if a geophysical survey causes me a problem, why should I bother with it? You know, why am I asking for this stuff if all I'm getting is a load of grief about it? And it's far easier for me to take an absolute tick box approach and say, right, okay, geophysics basically it doesn't really work, or we'll just do it and it's part of the program that we do and we won't think about it in any way. I spoke to one of my cross-border colleagues about a project that crosses the border, and he said, I hope in this project you will be asking for a DBA field walking, geophysical survey and trial trenching. And I said, well, I'll be starting with a DBA and then I'll see what goes on from there. Because I think you've got to build these things up. You can't start from the point of view you're going to do all of this. Just as you can't say, I'm not going to do any of this. It's pointless. So I need help from geophysicists to make those decisions properly. And if I'm not getting that help, then I can just cut out that stage and cut out the grief. And I think that quite a lot of sort of anecdotal discussions with other curators are putting them in roughly the same direction. Now, this is also affecting consultants. Now, obviously, we've had Hannah's view, and Hannah's clearly very pro-geophysics, which is good, but some consultants are saying, well, you're going to trench anyway, so exactly as Jimmy said, with all of the negatives, I get those as well. The difference is that Jimmy can convince people to do a geophysical survey. I get the thing that if I convince someone to do a geophysical survey, then they say, well, I can take this to the planning inspectorate, and is a planning inspector really going to care whether the information comes from a 5% trench survey or a geophysical survey? You could argue that if you want. That's quite difficult to push with a planning department that has targets about planning inquiries. Further difficulties, Hay and Lacey said that field evaluations 5% is a good percentage, that kind of thing. CBI minerals guidance, now the EH minerals guidance says 2% is an ideal trenching technique, all that thing. So much for that. The fact is, I don't think 2% trenching is enough to characterize a site. But if I take it down to 2% from 5% on the basis of a geophysical survey, that survey needs to be bigger than 5 hectares for it to be cost effective. So if I want a 3% or a 4% survey of the site, it has to be bigger than 5 hectares correspondingly to make a magnetometer survey worth it. It genuinely isn't cost effective. So again, I come back to this problem of I'm getting grief for this. Why should I bother about that if all I'm going to get is grief? Then I'd love to do more non-magnetic surveys. 8 years of being a curator, I think we've done 6 non-magnetic surveys. A couple of earth resistance, a couple of GPR, and one extremely interesting MagSUS in a set of excavated trenches. But I don't ask for them because they're not cheaper than trenching is cheaper. There is absolutely no, the costs now involved in trenching are so low that it's getting harder and harder to argue for geophysical surveys. So from that, I move on, and then I compare this, because I get really despondent about geophysics. Think, oh, that's it, I'm never going to bother with geophysics again, because I've convinced myself. Then I look at dirt archaeology. We keep a record of every problem contractor and every problem, and we pass that on to the Algarve Regional Committee once a quarter. And our archaeological geophysics comes out of that very well. Leaving aside a minority of a number of geophysical contractors, the geophysical level of geophysical complaints is very low compared to dirt archaeology. It suffers from exactly the same issues. I will just show you this because Yeah, I'll basically finish on this, I think. Ring ditch, it had 75 secondary inhumations, all early medieval, had a 2-metre trench, went right across it, including across the central burial, which missed the ditch and all of the secondary burials. My rogues gallery for dirt archaeology is huge. But the difference with that is most curators are happy because they've worked their way through digging archaeology. They're happy to tackle those problems. They're not happy to tackle geophysical problems because they don't have the confidence. And that's where you come in, really. You as geophysicists, you need to be targeting curators with telling us how to monitor you effectively. You should be encouraging us to be monitoring you as closely as possible. You need to be selling to us exactly why we should be doing geophysical surveys. I can say why it's a good idea to my fellow curators, but they just look at this Ken going on at geophysics again. I'm not a geophysical salesperson, but every single one of you who works for a geophysical contractor, you are a geophysical salesperson, and you need to be targeting curators and telling them why and how the job is done correctly and well, so that we then have the ammunition to turn back per surveys, per contractors, and say that no, this genuinely is unacceptable, and we will not accept method statements from you again. You need to give us that ammunition. I've put up staff qualifications. Obviously, need to be tackled, and experience needs to increase. We've heard about that. I mentioned accreditation. That's not a plea that everyone should join the IFA. It's not waving the flag for the Geological Society. There are ideas I came up with thinking about it. Is accreditation a way forward? I don't know. That's something you have to discuss with yourselves. But I think I'll leave it there since I've run out of time.
That things are warming up. Just one specific point. You say you asked for consistency. Could we not have consistency from planning archaeologists across the country? And could we not have some stronger guidance from English Heritage, not just from the geophysical consultants? Where are English Heritage in all this? Sorry, Paul, this is not a personal attack. It might be later. Where are English Heritage enforcing those guidelines, and where is the consistency in the planning archaeologists?
I'll dodge the English Heritage question because I don't represent them, and they can answer that for themselves at a different time. The consistency among planning archaeologists, that's a really good point. That's a question I ask regularly. We have a regional meeting in the east of England, and we say, okay, how do we tackle these things? We agree on a methodology, and we don't. And I then get information from other counties that they're not doing it according to the way I wrote it down in my notes. And they come back to me. They come back and say, "You're not doing it according to the way I've got it written in my notes." We discuss it, but it doesn't happen. You're entirely right.
Gosh. That's a good point to stop with.
I think the takeaway is John was right.
Yes. I was going to say that it's not just the geophysics that isn't consistent, it's across kind of all types of surveys and things. So geophysics isn't a special case on that, it applies to trenches, open strip map samples, field recording.
And curation.
Yeah.
And consultants. Yeah, anybody else that we want to?
Okay, we're asking GSB committee member today. We contacted, while we're organising today, I think we tried to contact every single curator in the country to invite them on. We got about a handful to come back. We got replies from more than that. And many of them said that with the budget cuts, they simply couldn't afford to come to something like today. So if you can't afford to come to us, how do we get this information back to you?
Well, where do curators congregate? There's work through ALGAO. ALGAO is the Association of Local Government Archaeological Officers. ALGAO runs training days. So I sit on the Planning and Legislation Committee. We have a Planning and Legislation training day once a year. We put out calls for training subjects. Contact ALGAO. Contact the IFA. A lot of curators are members of the IFA. Regardless of what you think of them, whether you're a member or not, or think that they're the best thing since sliced bread, or think they're tantamount to Satan. It doesn't matter. They are what we use. And that's where places like the IFA conference, Jimmy ran a session a couple of, was it the last one or the last 2 years ago? Yeah, which was well attended by curators. It worked very well. Places like that do exist, and it's, you have to engage with them.
The Peter Barker from Stratuscan again. The GOC 2 years ago, indeed, Jimmy and Duncan were there presenting to Algea Scotland, and that was very well attended by Algea members. Counties.
Just arrived in time for lunch.
The question, I'm one of the, I don't have the curators are here, but I certainly will be on one of those. And I'd agree, not being a geophysicist, I think I'd agree. Generally, I really don't feel able to really scrutinise and really drill down into the geophysical reports, perhaps in the way that we might with other things. Having said that, I don't really encounter any problems, I don't think. It is a sensitive data, but I think we would attend the northeast region like we usually meet in York. I have been sometime because my college generally goes, but there is an invitation generally for people to come and speak at those events, usually half an hour to an hour in advance of the archaeology meeting. So I'm sure if anybody wishes to attend the northeast regional archaeology meeting, I could probably facilitate that.
That sounds a good opportunity. I mean, it does. It surprises me in some ways that how infrequently anybody ever comes to me and asks my opinion, not me, but my opinion about other people's reports. I mean, does everybody else find that? Because I think it's astonishing that when you say you feel comfortable with looking at the reports, but could well be all sorts of things hidden away in that. As Ken showed, if you display raw data plus or minus 100, you're not really sure much of that.
I have been asked by our local curator when I pop into the office, she'll say, "Have a look at this. What do you think of that?" And I'm, "Well, that's crap."
Yeah,
that's what I thought. That's going back because she didn't feel that she had the knowledge. So that's all right in one sense, but the other sense is you don't get to see all those reports. How often do we look at each other's reports? Let's face it. You've got to get hold of them first. That's not that easy. Confidentiality, client won't let them out. 5 years. I mean,
6 months for 6 months for us. They have to be in the HER.
I mean, there's quite a lot online. I think now you can get representative samples.
Only about, I would say, less than 40% is actually online. From what I can gather in
40%. That's pretty good. It's better than some people are sampling in the.
I think it's going to the people who are having to monitor reports. But really, you showed examples there, and really it's only 3 or 4 basic things that you need to look out for that are warning signs, effectively, that the underlying data might not be very good. And so actually it's not a massive task to be able to just analyse the basic report and say, is this something that's fit for purpose? So
some of these you can pick up monitoring on site anyway. You can. Now we're getting to a point where we're charging for monitoring visits on site, so that's an income generator for us.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting point. I mean, what percentage of geophysical surveys that happen in your area do you go out and monitor?
I monitor about 50% of them.
That's astonishing.
Depends on
the amount of times okay, right? I don't do day in day out commercial stuff, but for 18 years, I've done commercial stuff, and I think the amount of times it's going to be from the planning control came out to see me once, twice. Billy no mates, obviously. That must be it. They didn't want to come talk to me. But the fact remains that was not part of the regime. There's this assumption that it'll be okay.
It still isn't, and there's some people who I take exactly the same approach with trial trenching and everything else. Some people where I look at them and I think actually. I can go out there, and what I'll do is I'll get a nice chat with you and a really good introduction to some really good archaeology. And there's some people I think, no, I need to go out and I need to look at them, and I'll need to say to them what I always say to them. So it does depend on who it is.
Okay. Right, and we really should stop there because we have a free lunch.
And if you want to abuse me in private, there's my phone number and my email address.
Yeah. I thought you were going to leave with that.
Yeah, all my stuff. We'd always said we'd take it back.
I think magic, there was a